Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are on our gorgeous but declining planet. Thank you for taking the time to join our community, your community of the ASI today. As you know, with these webinars, we try to do a community discussion followed by a presenter discussion. And today we have a presenter who is part of our community, a vibrant part of our community for many years, which is really exciting. I love when it's one of our own that can speak from their level of expertise and educate all of us, or educate me for sure. And so, first of all, the agreements of our webinars. So these community webinars are here to support our members and the mission of the ASI. We ask participants to stay connected, accountable, sensitive, and skillful when engaging today. We ask that you agree to create and maintain safe space for learning and growth. To that end, let's all refrain from marketing or self-aggrandizing while avoiding inflammatory or deliberately destructive comments. If you want to recommend a relevant and appropriate resource to attendees, please do so in the chat box. If you have advice, feedback, or suggestions for another attendee, please ask for their consent before offering it during your share. The ASI will remove participants who engage in harmful activity after one warning. Thank you so much for creating this community with us, showing up with presence, attunement, and self-awareness. While this doesn't feel comfortable for me, I want to put our donate button into the chat box because we completely rely on donations, and it's always like, okay, can we pay our assistant this month? So we'd like just to remind you, let's continue to make this happen and pay forward so that we can keep the ASI alive. Moving on from that, I'm delighted to present Julie Nelson. And so Julie, with her official teaching title as Seido Sensei, is a Zen teacher in the Soto tradition. She is the author of Practicing Safe Zen. It's a good name, huh? Practicing Safe Zen. Navigating the Pitfalls on the Road to Liberation. And it was published this summer, 2025, as well as works in Tricycle magazine and on her blog. Her spiritual home is the Greater Boston Zen Community, a group that experienced 3 waves of teacher abuses of power. She's deeply saddened when people, either in addition to or instead of realizing benefits from their work with a spiritual teacher, suffer great harm. So I hand you over to Julie.
Great. Thank you. Thank you to all of the ASI leadership and especially to Jack for inviting me to do this. I have to tell you a little funny story about the title for that. That was agreed on with my publisher. Somebody else had beat us to Practicing Safe Sects, SECTS. There's already a book by that name, so didn't get that one, but I'm in Zen anyway. So as Jack mentioned, in my Zen community, Zen sangha, as we call it, um, I was witness to 3 levels of 3 waves, really, of betrayal by teachers. One of them, the first one was a financial misappropriation of funds combined with bullying and gaslighting. The second one was sexual misconduct involving another member of the sangha. And the third one was another one of bullying. I was directly affected by the financial misconduct and the bullying and witnessed the sexual misconduct. And this was very puzzling. You know, I'd gone into Zen with a trusting heart. And I realized that good intentions are not enough. Um, with one possible exception, I think all of the teachers who behaved really unethically, uncaringly, harmfully, did not do so out of bad intentions, but out of ignorance, out of not understanding, out of letting certain dynamics in the teacher-student relationship run their course, being unaware of them. They caused great harm. So I was motivated to explore this, explore it in research, explore what goes on in other communities, experiment with different ways of organizing communities. And I also became an authorized Zen teacher in the middle of these abuses of power. So all of this research about accountability, guess who it's really directed to? It's directed to me. I'm really scared to death of being the next nightmare in my community. And there has to be some, some proactive steps to prevent that from happening. As I said, good intentions aren't enough. So the way this is going to go, I'm going to give some introductory remarks, then talk about the teacher-student relationship. Then we're going to take maybe a 10-minute break or so to have some questions and discussion. And then I'm going to go on to talk more about the structures and cultures of accountability, different kinds of forms, different kinds of elements of those. But let me start with a few assumptions. I realize that we come from all sorts of different traditions, occupations, relationships with other people on a spiritual path. Um, I'm going to start with three assumptions. One is that we became spiritual leaders of some kind because we wanted to help people. If you came in, if you became a spiritual leader because you wanted to make money or get control over other people, you can leave now. You're not interested in accountability, right? So I'm going to assume that we are all showing up here because we're interested in doing good and not doing harm. My second assumption is that we're all acknowledge, at least intellectually, if not every moment, that being human, we can make mistakes. Again, if you think you've become purely divine and have surpassed and overcome all of your humanity, um, the next hour is going to be a waste for you. Feel free to leave. Because being human, we can make mistakes. And the third important assumption is going to be a bedrock for what I'm talking about is that what we do as spiritual leaders has an element of mystery. The spiritual path is not cut and dried. So there are going to be things about our responsibilities, our accountability, that's going to be different than if we were a math teacher or a museum guide, right? We're dealing with people's spirits and souls. So this element of mystery gives new dimensions, additional dimensions. In terms of language, I'm going to use a shorthand teacher to mean whatever you're doing. Coaching, leading, guiding, being a priest, whatever. You're a person who people come to for guidance. And I'm going to use the word student for the person who comes to you for some kind of guidance. You might call them client, organization member, parishioner, whatever, but I'm just going to call that student. Because we come from so many different areas, I'm going to just use the term the divine to talk about what is this that we're trying to live in harmony with? What are we pointing to? You might call it God, higher power, Buddha, enlightenment. If I use the word divine, translate it into whatever you use. And finally, the accountability. What does accountability mean? I mean, it's basically taking responsibility for our behavior and its effects on our students and our spiritual communities. Now, let me just point out that, any human relationship we have, from the most casual with the cashier at the supermarket to the most intimate with, say, a spouse, has at least implicit agreements involved. Um, you expect me to do this, I expect you to do that. And we feel let down at a minimum when others fail to hold up their end of the relationship. And the more important the relationship is, the more if we feel let down, we may feel profoundly betrayed and feel deeply wounded and harmed. We may find it difficult to ever trust again if let down in an important relationship. So accountability is living up to those kinds of responsibilities. The culture of accountability means making sure that our mutual expectations are clear and wholesome. I'm sure we've all been in relationships where we found out too late in the game that we didn't have any real agreement going on, right? So making sure they're clear, making sure they're wholesome, they're for the benefit of the students, and being willing to be answerable to some people or communities for our behavior in relation to them. So that's going to be the whole kind of second half of the talk. How do we become answerable to someone about this? So let me first just talk a little bit more about this teacher-student relationship. There were a lot of things I didn't understand until after I'd been teaching for a number of years, and I really should have figured this out sooner. But a few obvious points: our behavior within the teacher-student relationship can help or harm. We teach to help. Students come to us because they believe we have the power to be helpful to them. And because they're coming to us for help, they become vulnerable. Because of that element of mystery I talked about, they usually need to suspend some of their rationality and normal protection of personal boundaries. They need to become somewhat more open to both the divine and to our guidance and influence. They put their faith in us, their trust in us to be guides to the mystery. A second part of this is because things are mysterious, they're not really sure what's going on, and we often enter into a fairly intimate relationship with them, that they are going to be involved in some dimensions of psychological transference and projection. They're going to tend to see us as embodiments of the divine. They're going to tend to idealize us as what they want to work towards. And that might have very little to do with how we are human beings, right? It's mostly going on in their heads, but we have to be very aware that is going on in their heads. And one of the big classic and very dangerous examples is when people come to confuse their love for the teachings, their love for the Dharma, for the divine, whatever, with a personal love for us, right? And that is one of the big danger situations. And it's, we're not going to change students into not doing that. And for some students, it's a necessary step. It's up to us to make sure that the relationship stays safe, even when they're doing projecting and transferring all sorts of stuff onto us. So they have trusted us. We do harm when our own needs and desires, consciously or unconsciously, get in the way of us serving the students. Right? Most of us don't consciously try to harm the students, but to the extent we see ways of meeting our own unmet needs through the students, we can end up doing harm. These often get called in the psychological and abuse literatures boundary violations. They've opened their hearts, they've let us in for the purpose of us guiding them on their spiritual path. We use that openness for any other purpose? No, that is a boundary violation. Um, Sexual, financial, emotional things that we might do that can be a form of exploitation. If it's not in their interest, we are misusing that openness and that trust. So the blurb for this talked about responsibilities on each side. In any relationship, I mean, it takes two to tango, right? So there are some responsibilities there. The way I see it, and of course, this can be grist for later discussion, is that the student's responsibilities in a teacher-student relationship or to a spiritual organization are really just normal human personal integrity and consideration. They should be honest. They should strive to not lie about themselves and to not lie about you. I've seen one case of false accusations against a teacher. It can be very damaging. So their responsibility is to be honest. They should live up to reasonable agreements if you've made some kind of agreement about reciprocating with money or time. You need to eat too, so charging some kind of reasonable fee if this is your full-time work is not an ethical violation, but it has to be reasonable. You're not trying to soak them. You're not trying to harm them or their family by asking too much in money or time or anything else. They should treat you with appropriate consideration and respect. If you have an intimate and ongoing relationship, they shouldn't just ghost you. For example, I have talked with teachers who've had students who just suddenly disappear, after years of work. That's just rude, right? It's not particular to this relationship. It's just a rude thing to do. But neither do students have any particular responsibility to be personally loyal or reverential. Right. Students have the right to leave, at any time. Hopefully they'll do it in a good way, but we shouldn't be asking for anything more than normal human consideration. Students should avoid causing unnecessary strife in the community. That's often a problem when you get a bunch of human beings together. However, it doesn't mean that they should never criticize and never cause any conflict. Some amount of conflict is often necessary and healthy in a community. In fact, if you always have total agreement, you're probably in a cult. Um, there should be some liveliness, some ability to criticize. So that's what I see as the main things on the student side. The teachers have got all of that and really important additional things. Beyond the normal human responsibilities, we have a sacred obligation to put the student's interest first. I think if put ourselves out there as a spiritual guide, that is our sacred obligation. That is our sacred covenant with the student. Um, we have to be worthy of their trust. Uh, and it's up to us to maintain the safety of the relationship. Let me mention a couple corollaries to that. Um, Corollary to that is that it is not the student's responsibility to maintain the appropriate boundaries in the relationship. It doesn't matter if they come on sexually to you. They might do that. That might be part of their process, and they've got to work through it and get over it. It doesn't matter. They are not violating ethics there. It's up to you to make sure the boundaries stay in place, even if their behavior is not appropriate. It's also not up to them to speak up when they see you doing something questionable. Okay. They are in a position of less power. They may feel fear going up against someone who they feel in some ways holds their spirit or soul, right? They may be so trusting of you that they trust your judgment more than theirs, and so they'll be hesitant to come forward. So we can't give the students the responsibility of keeping us accountable. That is inappropriate. We've got to find ways, other ways. And I want to make the point that seeking collective accountability in communities, is a sign of spiritual maturity. We would all like to think that we're just naturally responsible and accountable. If anybody checked us out, we would be just fine. Uh, this is natural. This is human. We like to feel well of ourselves, and no one finds it pleasant to be blamed, right? And there is such a thing as toxic blame. Toxic blame says you did that because you're an evil person and you will need to reflect on how bad you are for the rest of your life. Unfortunately, a lot of us got a little bit of that as kids somewhere, so it can really hurt if toxic blame is directed at us. Accountability is something very different. It doesn't say any of that at all. It doesn't say you're a bad person. It doesn't have to say you have to wallow in this. Uh, Accountability is more impersonal and it's more forward-looking than that. It's impersonal because it says, you screwed up because you're human. Okay. This isn't about you as an individual being evil. It's you're human. Humans make mistake. Okay. This incident happened. Harm was done. You need to reflect on, sorry. Now you need to acknowledge that and work to make things right. So this thing happened. I got to say, I did it. And now it's future looking. Seeking collective accountability, community accountability is a sign of spiritual maturity, because we all like to believe that we're doing well. We want to avoid the blame of being told we're evil people. But accountability is not about being told that we're evil. It's being reminded that we're human, pointing out that we make a mistake. And then we need to acknowledge we make the mistake, try to make the situation right again, try to make the people who've been harmed whole. Without the collective kind of accountability, without having other people who will help us in this, we've got some natural tendencies. We'll tend to pay attention to positive feedback, especially from our students. And if our students are feeling not only respectful but reverential, boy, can that go to our heads. And this can be very subtle, right? We may not notice it happening, but we might have subtle ego inflation going on. If we're treated as closer to the divine than a normal human being, we can subtly start to believe that we are really closer to the divine, unless we're very careful. We also, being human beings, will tend to resist and try to reject and bury criticism because it feels bad, right? Nobody likes to be criticized. Our first reaction is likely to be attributed to bad motivations on the part of the student or the person complaining. It's about their ego. It's about their immaturity. Um, they're trying to put toxic blame on us. They've got a victim mentality. Um, they're being too harsh. What they're saying is okay, but they're saying it wrong. There's all sorts of ways of trying to deflect criticism. So our natural human tendency is to hear the good stuff, block out the bad stuff, and we will tend to be overconfident. And not only will we be overconfident, we won't even be aware of the fact we're being overconfident. So if we're ignorant of things like transference and projection, and we're overconfident in our own goodness, I would call these rookie mistakes. Okay, these are common mistakes about spiritual teachers who have not matured in their practice. And so seeking out collective accountability is a way of growing in ourselves, getting to know ourselves better, including those dark sides that we don't want to see, and learning how to act and accept accountability from others. So this is about the midpoint of what I wanted to say. So we're going to stop for maybe about 10 minutes from some discussion. I'll throw out a couple questions if you don't have something to you want to say right away anyway. Like, have you thought about accountability in this way before? And is there something scary for you in thinking about accountability? And Jack is going to kind of moderate, so please speak up or raise hands or whatever she says.
Yes. Uh, i- well, let's try popcorn. Let's try popcorn. We're just under 30 people. It usually works well with under 30. If you've something to say, unmute yourself and let's see how it goes. I'm going to share something myself then. One thing I've noticed over the years is that and this is myself too, like as a teacher, when when we do something that is part of our shadow, or there's a pattern that we have, our needs are not being met, any of these reasonings that Julie so clearly gave us around what our blind spots are in order for us to actually behave badly without us noticing it, without us being self-aware enough. Post admitting it, making amends, repairing, if we don't have some support system to keep that part of our own blindness in check, pretty much close to always, we will make the same violation again or a version thereof. There's something about that. If we have a tendency to do something, it's not a one and done that's going to shift that out of our psyche and we're good to go because we did it once. That tendency is going to take a while to burn out. Just like any piece of conditioning that we have, you might unpack it and then like a couple of years later, it's like, darn, I resolved all of that trauma. I went into all of that. That was sorted. Here I am again, back into that same old pattern. You know how this goes. You married the same person twice, kind of thing. Um, so like whatever it is that is our blind spot, unless we take responsibility enough, have the spiritual maturity and emotional maturity to like, I got to put something in place to make sure that blind spot doesn't regrow. There's a high likelihood we'll do it again. And I've seen that again and again and again with spiritual teachers. Just want to share it. Jeff, I see your hand up, Jeff.
I love this conversation so far. I'm wondering about the role of trauma for both teachers and students in harm that gets done. Because my own opinion is that can play a huge part on both sides of the equation, if you will.
Thank you, Jeff. Julie, would you like to speak to that?
Yeah, I haven't gone very deeply into that myself, but I know there are people who talk about trauma-informed therapy, trauma-informed chaplaincy. Maybe that would be a future workshop here, because when people have been through trauma, they're going to have some antenna out that may be very sensitive and that we may not understand or see. When you've been through trauma, you may do what will look like to other people as an overreaction, which just to you is just normal keeping of safety. So it's going to help if the people in your relationship with, like a spiritual guide, spiritual teacher, understands about what trauma can do to a person and a person's emotional reactions and how to be careful around that. I mean, trauma can also, lead people to, in positions of power to create violations, right? Because of their own unmet needs around that trauma. So it can, have effects on both sides.
Yeah. And it also has to do with the ongoing support of how do we manage that traumatized part of ourselves. The ongoing support and giving ourselves the care. Self-care is so important. It's not about bubble bath and crystals. That's not self-care. But going much, much deeper, I think, to take care of the traumatized little one inside ourselves. It's an ongoing responsibility that we have to do. Jerry?
Thank you. The question about trauma brought something to mind, and that is I see um, a very common pattern that people place themselves in the role of a teacher or and an authority of some sort to isolate themselves and give themselves a sort of immunity uh, so that they don't have to deal with uh, the various things. Oh, I'm the teacher. I know. And I'll tell you. You won't tell me. Like that. That's exaggerated. But there's this arm's length. I'm untouchable. I'm the teacher. I'm on the pedestal. I will give the wisdom, and you will receive it, sort of thing. And even just in casual interactions with many, many, many teachers, you find there's this distance. They're holding you at arm's length to the point that it can be just maddening. And what that speaks to is there's there's a need in them, in us, that drew us to really devoting all of ourselves to finding the solutions to life. And to whatever extent we have found really good, useful things, we want to share them with everyone, right? But we may still feel really wounded somewhere and really vulnerable and, kind of um, in need of a safe place where we can sort of hide out, and you can hide out in that role of being a teacher. It's a very safe place, and I wonder how to kind of bring that pattern to the surface and find ways to work on it and find ways for the healers to heal enough to be able to let down that boundary between the teacher and the student and just be human, and relax into the fact that we're allowed to be imperfect. We're allowed to make mistakes. We don't have to know everything. We don't have to have all the answers. So those are my thoughts on that.
Yeah, if I can just a quick comment, maybe another workshop at some point can be all about spiritual bypassing, which is the term that I know for what you're describing, that if I'm just holy enough, I don't have to deal with my psychological issues, right? Which is a total farce, but a very common one, and probably one that we all, still engage in to some extent, but, hopefully not to the degree you're talking about.
And then if we look at the, spiritual texts, there were so many who were like living apart from the world. It's modeled to have this monastic life, and it's like awakening isn't happening in that way anymore. It never did, actually, but the books got written by those who were pulled up out of society. And I'm thinking right now of a spiritual teacher who has questionable ethics, and uh, very much is apart because no, I've nothing to say. I don't need friends who want to talk about what's on TV or sport, or I'm not interested in that. And that person actually has really poor social skills, really poor. like, it's like, oh my God, they've forgotten their humanness. They have no place for their humanness to connect. And so all kinds of boundaries are being broken because they won't let themselves be challenged in normal, regular life. So they're losing touch, but they don't even know they're losing touch because they're doing what Scripture said. So what do we do with that? Watch it. Just watch it within ourselves is all we can do, you know? Dave?
Actually, that was a good segue you mentioned in scripture there. I just want to give a very quick example. I had a lady that was asking a question about whether it was her experience with her psychologist, whether it was right or not. And she'd gone to a psychologist. She was a woman that was recovering from religious trauma. And was directed to a psychologist, and she explained this about her religious trauma and the fact that she'd left religion, and she'd had her session, and on closing the session, the psychologist said to her, "God bless." Now, this is such a natural statement that someone may say. I mean, one of my pet peeves is, in all of these online things, people say, well, if I knew, I wouldn't be here listening, So it's one of those natural things I think that she would normally probably use in all other instances. But in that one particular occasion, being made aware of what the session was for, was seen as she came out of it feeling horrible. Yeah.
And then if we don't have systems of feedback where our clients, students feel confident about giving us this feedback, we never know. And we'll do harm again because we can't even be responsible or make amends. So having feedback systems is really important also, you know. We're at the 10 minutes, and I promised Julie I wouldn't let this part go over 10 minutes so that she can go into the next phase. Thank you, everybody, for participating.
Yeah, thank you.
Let's dive in again.
Okay. So the second part of my talk is about the cultures and structures of collective accountability. What I've seen work very badly in a number of cases is what I call accountability light, which is the illusion of being accountable, but not really doing it. I mentioned good intentions. We like to think that our good intentions are going to keep us safe, but of course they fail to take into account our own shadow, our own unconscious, our own unmet needs, and our own capacity for self-deception. So good intentions aren't enough. Checking in with our partners or peers is often thought of as accountability. The problem is that they will probably tend to share your biases. Particularly, say, teaching peers are probably just as blind to you as what the situation looks like from the student point of view, right? They're sharing your teaching perspective. They're not seeing it from the other side. Spouses have reasons to try to protect their relationship with you. They're not going to be your biggest, most objective critic. So just checking in with the people you're comfortable with probably means you're going to get comfortable feedback, right? So it's not going to do the job. Having vague or file drawer statements of ethics or values. You might have a community that has an ethics policy. Nobody really knows what's in it. Nobody's looked at it in 10 years. It's a dead document. There's some Zen groups whose ethics policy is a statement of precepts that go way back, just like 10 statements or something like that. Not really enough. It means it's not really part of the culture, and it may be too vague to do any good. Easily ignored and easily interpreted in all sorts of wild ways. Another form of accountability light is encouraging anyone with a complaint to talk privately with you or maybe to engage in mediation. That can be good for some things. You would hope that you would have open communication and people would want to bring feedback, but you can't rely on that. Again, they may be scared of you, okay? You might not feel like a scary person, but that's irrelevant. What they're projecting or transferring onto you if it's scary to them, they're not going to be able to do it. And for a lot of people who have run into manipulative teachers, that's opening themselves to more trauma, right? To come in and talk to you individually. So that sort of thing isn't so good. Mediation is appropriate particularly appropriate in interpersonal conflicts among people of equal power. Cases of ethical misconduct by people at different levels of power, not so good. The mediation is not going to empower the person on the downside enough, and can even make things worse. So be careful about just thinking about mediation. Sometimes people think, simply apologizing and promising to do better. This goes back to Jack's thing, a comment about if you've done some kind of unethical misconduct once, you're likely to do it again. Just apologizing and saying, "Oh, I'll try to do better," that's accountability light. It's not going to do the job. So let me talk about what I see as ways of building structures and cultures of accountability. I'm going to start by talking about forms, and then I'm going to talk about sort of the content, the features of a accountability culture. And the forms I'm going to take from the crudest, the ones we should really be trying to avoid, down to the ones where we may be able to do more refinement and building. So the crudest level of accountability actually already exists. It's the court system. It's the police. If you rape someone, if you rob someone, you can call the police, you can go to jail. If you have what seems to you, and if you're a clergy person, and you have what seems to you and them to be a consensual adult sexual relationship, that is still considered criminal in 13 states. It is just wildly inappropriate to have that. Consent is a very slippery, if not non-existent idea when it comes to spiritual teachers and students of any kind. So the law is out there, right? Criminal law in these cases. There's also civil law. If you agree to give somebody something and they give you something else in return, you come to somebody for spiritual counseling or psychological counseling, and they seduce you, you can also bring a lawsuit. Okay, so that for the teacher who offends could be very costly. You have to defend yourself. You may have to pay fines, monetary settlements to people. But I mean, these are kind of worst case structures of accountability. They clearly have a lot of drawbacks. They're very crude. It's very adversarial. There can be lots of negative publicity for both the defendant and the complainant. Often a complainant will be dragged through the mud just as much as the person being complained about. Using the courts tends to be very expensive, tends to be very time-consuming. So not the ideal situation we want as our structure. But on the positive side, it does exist as a last resort. And some people who've been wronged by spiritual teachers have had the money and the time to do it. And in some ways, they may have gotten some kinds of restitution, or at least acknowledgement by the court, if not by the perpetrator, that something bad was done to them. And that alone can help healing, just having somebody listen to and understand and believe your story. It could also potentially stop harm by the defendant, if they go to jail, or if the monetary settlements are onerous enough, it might make them think twice and decide to go sell shoes instead or something, right? So, I mean, it could have some preventative effect, but obviously big, kludgy, expensive, very far from ideal. Another structure of collective accountability is media, both standard news media and reporting, and increasingly social media. People can get called out. So news reports often get the word out about some kind of misconduct, or at least allegations of misconduct. Even if a lawsuit is later withdrawn or settled quietly, the media coverage is one way of calling someone to account. The old school way of calling someone to account, at least in Zen groups, was an open letter. several of the teacher's peers or several of the teacher's senior students would get together, write a letter, literally write it, mimeograph it, put it in an envelope with a stamp, send it to all their friends. Okay. The modern version of that is Reddit, blogs, websites, somewhere where you write a statement about this happened and you really got to watch out for this person. Right. So that is a way of getting some word out there. And it may be a personal first-person story. It may be, from some group of people. This one also has some drawbacks. There's no structure there to make sure it's impartial and fair. It's hard to judge credibility when you're just reading something on a website, unless you're totally gullible and believe everything you read on the website. It may not stop the harm from abusers if the social media doesn't have a wide readership and the person is still selling books, right over and left. That person still kind of a wide reach, might not stop them. And it may directly cause harm if someone is making false accusations, or a perpetrator of abuse is making counter accusations. Right. One of the common ways that people defend themselves is by saying, oh, that person, they're crazy, they're a bad student, they're, making all sorts of false allegations in return. So there's no guarantee of fairness in that process. But again, it has some advantages. It's better than nothing in giving voice to a victim, and it may be better than nothing in preventing future abuse. In my sangha, we thought long and hard and put a little two-statement sentence on our website saying such and such a teacher has been dismissed due to sexual and other forms of abuses of power. And with the hope being that somebody who's thinking of working with this person will Google their name and words like, scandal, cult, misconduct, something like that, and find it. So it's not, there should be better ways, but it does have its advantages. Getting to some of the ones that we could actually build and shape, so it's not just the Wild West out there. One is professional organizations with an explicit accountability culture. That is, professional organizations generally of peers. The kind of model that's used for licensed psychotherapists, licensed social workers, most mainstream denomination clergy belong to some kind of clergy group. Financial planners have a professional group. Anybody who's in what's called a fiduciary relationship. A fiduciary relationship, a lot of people think that's just about money, but it's about trust. If you've got somebody coming to you trusting that you're going to, they're going to help you, that's a fiduciary relationship. And most fiduciaries, especially people who take money for their services, have some kind of professional association that lays down some kind of code, maybe bolstered by state licensing boards, etc. But somebody who sets the standards. In Zen, there's a couple of teacher organizations that have taken some steps in this direction, at least in the last 5 or 6 years, doing investigations, posting things about bad actors. And there's some other teacher associations that throw up their hands and don't want to deal with it, which is extremely disappointing to me. The pros of this compared to those earlier ones, they have the potential to be impartial. They have the potential to be confidential, so you're not trashing people's reputations unnecessarily, right? And they can be at least somewhat effective. There is no license to teach Zen in the Zen community, so people who have been dismissed by a professional association often still go on teaching. But if the professional association makes some kind of public statement, again, it's there as a warning, and it also lets the victims know that they were heard and that their community is behind them. The cons of the professional organization is it does take commitment, time, energy, and money. Okay, I think it should be well worth it for anyone in a spiritual leadership position to seek out forming these kinds of organizations and put those resources in, but not everybody agrees. So there are things that have to happen. The fourth and last sort of organization I'll talk about is the local level organization. In my case, our Zen Sangha, our local Zen community. but whatever kind of organization you are in that's kind of on the ground. It could also have an explicit accountability culture. If you're in an organization that's in the US, a 501c3, if you're in some other country, whatever the legal nonprofit structure is, the board has what's called a duty of care for the organization. And a lot of boards don't really understand this. A lot of boards think that they're there to carry out whatever the teacher says, right? They just take care of the business matters and take direction from the teacher. That's wrong. I mean, they're actually not fulfilling their duty under the law to be responsible to the organization. And that includes making sure that people in the organization don't come in and get harmed, right? So the board should be educated about this and be willing to stand up. And again, it's hard to stand up to a teacher, which in our case, we found that getting some having one of the Soto Zen Buddhist Association, one of the overarching teacher organizations, also investigate and say, yes, wrong was done, helped us out a lot, because otherwise we were just looked at as a little group of whiners, right? So it's nice to have both accountability at a local organization and at something bigger that can add to that voice. But my board during a Greater Boston Zen community during the sexual abuse scandal was exceptional, really exceptional in the way they recognized their duties. And they really put in the time and the effort to see that the right thing was done by the victim. And while the teacher was also treated fairly, right? The pros and cons of doing this in your local organization are the same as for the professional organization: commitment, time, energy, and money. So these things are not cost free. Some of those board members had terrible burnout after this because it just took hours and hours to deal with this stuff. So those are some levels from the crudest to where we might be able to make the most inroads. If we're thinking about setting up a culture of accountability at a professional level and or a local level, what would be some features of that? And here I've done a lot of research looking around, some experimenting. But one of the most important things is to have a clear, live, and shared ethics policy. An ethics policy that is clear, it's not just some vague statements, but actually lays out some details. It should describe acceptable and unacceptable behaviors, spell out what it means by sexual, financial, or emotional misconduct. A lot of ethics policies will have things in there about dual roles. Can you be both someone's spiritual teacher and say their psychotherapist? A lot of research says that's a bad idea, right? Okay, so there might be a policy about whether that can happen. Or can your student be your student and also your lawyer? That can also be a bad idea. Dual roles create problems. Transparency, what has to be known widely. Confidentiality, conversely, what shouldn't be known widely. Including a lot of things your students are telling you. Mandatory reporting. This is something that states may require if somebody brings to you something about sexual abuse or elder abuse. So a lot of things can go into these to make them clear. They need to be live and shared. It's not just a document put in a board, in a drawer somewhere. Okay. We dropped the ball more than we should have after the second of these betrayals in making sure that this was really live and understood and part of our culture. In this ethics policy, besides describing what should and shouldn't happen, are mutual agreements about what this relationship and what this community are going to be about. Besides describing those agreements, there should be an accessible and impartial grievance procedure. So there should be a description in the policy of who someone should take a complaint to. And in case it's a complaint about you, it should not be to you. So it's usually to an ombudsperson or a committee of some kind. And if they have trouble with the ombudsperson, then there's an alternate, but they should be able to find somebody that they feel comfortable going to that they can talk to about what has happened. And then how that complaint is going to be handled. Okay. Is there going to be some kind of initial thing about credibility? Will there be an investigation? what's going to happen? Who's going to take care of this? What's going to happen with it? And then possible outcomes for the teacher, for the student. If there's been a case of serious, if it's an interpersonal conflict kind of thing, maybe mediation. Some ethics policies talk about that. But if it's some kind of thing having to do with ethics and potential misconduct, especially in a relationship of uneven power, it really needs to prescribe impartial investigation of any credible allegation. This may require money. It may require hiring somebody from outside your group. That's often recommended because people within the group have trouble both being unbiased and appearing unbiased, even if they are unbiased. So anyway, impartial investigation with due process for both parties. Okay, you have to listen to the accused as well, find out what their side is, and an appropriate level of confidentiality. Okay, so you probably don't blast everything out to the world right away, but you do your investigation before deciding, what to disclose and to whom. And then again, back to Jack's comments about, if you do something bad once, you'll probably do it again. It should prescribe results that repair harm and prevent future harm, right? Because prevention is much better than trying to clean up after the mess has been created, right? This can include, if necessary, if serious harm is incurred, meaningful sanctions. The lightest sanction might be some kind of private warning. Maybe it's somebody's first time, it was fairly minor, just a good talk would help. But for more serious cases of abuse, it really should include public censure, right? Making it known, making a statement about what's gone on. Suspension or revocation of teaching credentials, if that's possible. A lot of groups, that's not possible because it's kind of the Wild West, but to the extent it's possible, that clearly can make a statement in cases where someone has seriously abused and doesn't seem to understand the amount of harm they caused. There should be a requirement for significant restitution. What that's going to mean is going to vary in different cases. If you misused funds, you should repay them, obviously. If there's been emotional or sexual abuse, paying for someone's therapy for a few years, help them get over it. That's another form of restitution. It's often a good idea to ask the people harmed what they feel like they need to be made whole. And it's usually not punishment for the offender or an idea of reconciling with the offender so much as they really want to be heard, they really want to be backed up, and they really want to prevent this from happening to other people. So they might have some very good ideas about how to go at those areas. And there should be, if the teacher says, oh, okay, I realize I really did screw up, and the screw up was really serious, there has to be some clear and rigorous procedures for supervised rehabilitation. Another form of accountability light is, oh yeah, I seduced a student. I know it was wrong. I won't do it again. I'm going to choose my own therapist and go see them for a year. And while I continued to teach, and then I'm to declare myself, healed and ready to go. No, that leads to another abuse and another abuse and another abuse. If you look at the history of that stuff, that's just what happens. So what really needs to happen, say in a case of sexual predation, the person's got to stop teaching, probably for at least 3 or 4 years, go to someone who specializes in clergy sexual abuse, and be evaluated by, say, a panel of peers at the end of that time as to whether they think they might be safe. And they might have to come back under some kind of strictures. You can't meet alone with anyone anymore, whatever, but some meaningful ways of creating safety. And now I've probably talked on much longer than I should have. So we're going to stop again. A couple of questions you might think about. If you've had an issue with a student or a client, do you seek support from somebody who might have a similar bias to yourself? And what options do you think might be available to you as you continue to mature in your teaching?
Wow, that's fabulous, Julie. Thank you. I love this conversation personally, so I am biased. And I like your book, so I'm doubly biased. But I want to bring people's attention to this great question that Dave Doyle put in the
Chat.
David, do you want to read it, or will I read it? If I don't
Well,
hear from you, I'm just going to go for it.
I didn't know how to put up my hand. Well, I'll just read it the way I wrote it out here. It says, have you published any guidelines for your organization specifically intending to reduce the likelihood of future abuses?
And are you talking to the ASI or to Julie with her own Zen Buddhist community in Boston?
Her own Zen Buddhist community in Boston. Because I've actually been asking different groups from time to time if they have guidelines. And let me just actually finish these. So things like teacher-student interaction guidelines, guidelines for students to read, guidelines for teachers to read, guidelines for sanctuary settings themselves. I mean, I know a lot of things like dress codes and things like that to try and keep things from maybe getting too sexual or whatever, perfume not being allowed, you know. Another one is, it's interesting to note the fact that consensual relationships with students, that's illegal. You know, unethical, I've heard, but actually illegal is like, God, I did not even know that until you mentioned it. I mean,
In 13 states.
well, in 13 states, that's quite a few. But the fact is, okay. And then another one is, also, do you have guidelines on how to legally proceed with a relationship with a student? Because, you know, such as like, I was with a group where you had to basically declare that you intended to have a relationship. And then there was a waiting period of something like a year. And they were steadfast about that. And, but, you know, it was great that it was laid out of this is how you would proceed, because the fact is, we know that a lot of spiritual teachers and ministers met their spouse,
Mhm.
you know, as when they were when their spouse was a student or a congregant. And so anyway, I'm really fascinated about what you might have from the standpoint of uh, guidelines and procedures that people can read and see ahead of time.
Mhm. Yeah, I've got 2 places where I wrote them down. One is this, the book. I drew a lot on our experience in our community and Greater Boston Zen community. bostonzen.org, our website, has an ethics policy that's soon to be revised, but where we tried to incorporate, you know, a lot of these things that we'd learned. Um, Also, somewhere on the website under individual meetings, because in the individual meetings is where a lot of the abuse occurred. In Zen, teachers and students will meet one-on-one in a separate room. Um, there's a handout that I put it listed in the book, and it's on the website. That's some guidelines for students about the one-on-one meetings. It includes facts that um, you know, just describes the fact that the teacher is not going to be your, you know, your best friend, your lover, your, you know, parent, this kind of stuff. There are some teachers have abused. Here's some warning signs. If they ask for extra meetings with you, if they ask you to keep their personal secrets, got a couple of the warning signs in there. And also, you know, if your expectations of your teacher are overblown, you know, the teacher might tell you, or you might need to, you know, talk to somebody about that. So a little bit, you know, just a one sheeter laying out some expectations and some warnings. Just those warnings would have been really helpful in our case, just to acknowledge that teachers can sometimes do wrong, and here's some red flags that things might, you know, or at least yellow flags to watch out for. Our ethics policy now is like 8 pages or something like that, and it used to be like 4. You know, it's very inadequate. Zen Center of Los Angeles has something like a 40-page ethics policy. They went through a couple of different waves of misconduct, so you know they get into a lot of detail. Yeah, if you cruise a lot of places, you know, websites, you get a lot of different examples of this. Um, I put together a spreadsheet at one point because we were researching what we wanted to put in ours, and I put in links to 20 different ethics policies. Some will say, you know, dual relationships could be handled with care. In our case, the sexual misconduct, the teacher who did that was also the student's unlicensed pastoral counselor for pay, and our board put in no dual relationships. that was just compounded the harm so much. But some of these things are a little discretionary in terms of creating a legitimate relationship, sexual romantic relationship between a teacher and a student. The thing you described, immediately disclosing, immediately stopping having a student-teacher relationship and having a waiting period, seems to be generally agreed to be best practice. How long the waiting period is, I think in our policy we put it up to the discretion of the board. Some cases people have, met as teacher and student once or twice and they're similar age, level of attractiveness. The rest, maybe a 3-month or a 6-month waiting period would be plenty. Just time for the student to make sure they love the person and not just the teaching, right? Unfortunately, most of the cases are, the teacher's 20 or 30 years older. This teaching relationship has been going on for years. That one, you would need a long waiting period. A year might not be enough. It might need to be a 2 or 3 year waiting period if that is going to convert into something else. So I think I touched on the questions you raised there. From my point of view, anyway. David, you're muted.
Yeah, perhaps one thing I would love to see the association do is have a specific site where we could find those things. Because I was actually trying to compile that, and I asked different blogs that I've been on, and the response was really, really minimal. But it's like I'm not an expert in what groups have been abused, and obviously then those groups like yourself that tend to become proactive as far as trying to create some guidelines. I just think it's really interesting because a lot of students have come, a lot of teachers, myself included. I didn't come from, when I started teaching, I didn't come from a whole tradition on many levels. I had several major teachers, and so they may have had guidelines, but I don't have those guidelines. And the actual legalities are interesting. I think it's also, I think the students, being able to provide the students actually with a guideline on, perhaps not putting the teacher on a pedestal and approaching them modestly or whatever, and not encouraging, certain types of things. I don't know to what extent you guys have ever elaborated on those things, but I'm very, very interested in those kinds of guidelines.
We, at the start of the ASI, we did put some guidelines for students. To be honest with you, I haven't looked at them in about a year, maybe even more. Some guidelines for students around that. And we did, I suppose, in the ASI, it's time for us to grow some teeth. But very early on, introducing these ideas, there were not a lot of people interested in being accountable. There was a lot of people interested in, don't change me, I've got a nice gig going. So we did accountability light. We did. But I suppose myself, looking at what's happening politically in the US, I'm like, oh my God, the absence of accountability is like systemic, just systemic. So what are we going to do here? Are we part of the problem now? Or do we develop some teeth? So that's kind of something that I'm chewing on with the board of the ASI these recent months. Do we come in with something more, with something tighter and expect more? There's not a lot of us who are actually willing to, as far as my experience, there's not a lot of us who are really willing to grasp this thorny rose. There's not a lot of us who really want to be challenged and to do better from that place. So what do? We just do it anyway, or we kind of go with the speed of the group? And personally, I'm like, let's do it anyway and raise the bar, and whoever comes, comes. But this is kind of a group discussion. This is something for the community of the organization to feel into and see what wants to happen here. So there's that angle. Looking back, when we debated long and hard around how do we deal with sexual boundaries between teachers and students, and I spoke with many spiritual teachers who the ones who ended up in good relationships and married their spouses were very much, oh, it's fine as long as you talk and you talk your way through the power differential and you come to consent. I'm like, how can you have consent? How can you have consent after like a week? You know? But yeah, because we talked our way through it. I'm like, oh my God. So you know, it's a rare exception. And to make the rare exception a guideline for everybody won't work. But that same teacher, if that guideline of something very tight and like at least a year, if we had put that in, which I think is a guideline in some psychotherapy, I know there's 2 years in the European one, for psychotherapists to follow if you want to have a sexual relationship, like you wait for 2 years. You stop the teacher or the therapist client relationship and you wait 2 years. Is it adhered to? Not really. But I bounced that idea off other spiritual teachers who ended up in very positive relationship with students. And they're like, I wouldn't follow it. I just wouldn't follow it. I'd do my own thing. Well, human nature is a crazy thing. So trying to find some consensus. Yes, David. Mhm.
Yeah. I think that, if you talk to a lot of people outright and they think they're going to be able to self-regulate. But at the same time, part of what I was alluding to earlier is like an example. I didn't know that in 13 states, it's completely illegal. And I think a lot of the spiritual teachers, if they could find a well where they could look at guidelines, they would be interested in looking at the guidelines, even if it's for their new student teachers. They may think, well, geez, I've got a student teacher here and he's not nearly as wise as me. Let's see. So
design guidelines for everybody else.
yeah. But the thing is, having them available would be very useful because also there are some of us that we're teaching, and like a perfect example is we're teaching, and all of a sudden it doesn't take too long before you realize quite a few people that are coming in are in need of not me. They're in need of maybe some serious help. Particularly in spiritual stuff, a lot of people wander in they're really seriously have problems, but they're too embarrassed in many ways, maybe, to seek help, or they've tried to, or their parents have forced them to seek help and they run from that, but they know they've got a problem. And so all of a sudden you're 6, 8 weeks, 10 weeks into somebody and they've been great students, but then all of a sudden the cracks start showing and you realize they've got some serious mental problems. And then I'm like, what do I do with that? Now, luckily, very luckily, one of my best students is a clinical psychologist. So I've asked him. I remember one particular situation in a workshop where I had to kind of back somebody off a bit. And then afterwards, I consulted with my student who has a professional degree on this. I said, how was I? And he goes, you were perfect. Says that person has ADHD and they really needed to be kind of put in place because they like that instruction was extremely helpful. But so it's like, but without, if he wasn't there, I'm like clueless. This is to me what I was hoping that this group was so many levels. It was like, I'm a teacher. Here's my problem. I've got mentally ill people that are coming in. Some are not obvious. Some are very obvious. Or as an example, I have some woman that is just, she stands 2 feet from me and she is on me. And, do I have like a guideline sheet that I could hand her and say, Susie, read these, without being offensive to her. And so tools, just practical tools and guidelines that a teacher can read that elucidate some of these things. And, like also sanctuary practices so that when people come into a sanctuary, they leave their habituations to a certain level of looseness out the door. And now you're in a spiritual sanctuary situation where there are boundaries. and there are levels of appropriate dress, appropriate conduct, and appropriate I don't know. Anyway, yeah, I think I probably made my point there.
Thank you, David. Julie, do you want to respond? Because we've three hands
No,
up.
three people have their hands up, and I'd really like to hear what they have to say.
Okay, I'm going to go for Tara. Just hear a female questioner. Tara, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay. Yes to everything we're talking about in terms of the guidelines and then enforcing them and all the ways to do that. So I'm on board with all that. I think my personal interest and desire revolves around the prevention from the very beginning and what's going on in spiritual teaching in the industry that could be addressed. And I think there's three things that I've noticed in my experience. And I don't have the answer for this, but maybe as much time, energy, and maybe, Jack, as you were saying, a few people do take this on as a goal. So the first one is a big one, and that's humility to the divine and the relationship with the divine. And I think this is a tough one because this work itself is about, for many different teachings and books and teachers, it is teaching that there's no separateness. So that's like an easy way for the spiritual bypassing to really get fed. I think it's much bigger issue than is recognized and a bigger source of problems that are not that lead to, let's say, the second thing, which is the shadow, the traumas can get healed would be great, but I think some of them just get suppressed under the control skills that we all learn through the meditations, through the embodiment work. And so a solution I saw that didn't work was peer-to-peer feedback, because it also got avoided because what do I want to say? I think it's also easy to hide in the teacher-student relationship. So what's necessary is to have peer-to-peer relationships and not just a feedback session, but actually to be doing governance work together. And it's amazing how quickly the shadows show up when the power is taken away and you've got peer-to-peer work that needs to be done, and it all gets revealed. Okay, so I saw that. And then this leads to the third big thing, which is freedom, which is another big important concept, and I would say like a hiding area for some of this stuff. So when I was part of a group of 40 spiritual teachers working through all this, if push comes to shove and we're pushing for more responsibility, it always came down to back to freedom. No one can be forced to do any of this. So we've got to allow people to be free to choose whether they want to do more shadow work, more trauma work. And then it always led us back to, I'm done. I've done 25 years of all this. So it was just like circular, how quickly it's very, very hard to get people to want to keep going through the shadows, the traumas, all the negative stuff we don't want to. And I think the whole industry just gives people lots of outs, and it's up to you how deep you're going to go. And people are getting off everywhere and writing books and creating religions. But in the end, maybe it's just a couple of things that need to be like redefined, readdressed for the world. That's where I'm at.
Thank you, Tara. Julie, would you like a quick response before we?
I think as we're getting a little short on time, so let me shut up for a while.
Tom, I'm going to pull you in simply because, Jerry, we just want to give new speakers a chance first. Tom.
Hi, thank you all.
I have the benefit. I'm grateful for being a Zen teacher. I'm also an MD, and I have the experience in my MD life of being parts of organizations that um, give certifications um, and demand continuing education, and standards. And as has been said, I've heard said a number of times here, it's kind of the Wild West. And people all over are simply setting up their own standards. And I'll volunteer myself to be a part of an organization that will try to establish some standards, recommended educational processes that will be a part of being a part of, let's say, an organization like Association for Spiritual Integrity. My impression right now is that anyone can join ASI and they can advertise that without adhering to any kind of program that encourages their own growth and spiritual integrity. And I, I think there's a mismatch there that I think as Jack may have been referring to, putting some teeth into this. So I don't know what the answers are, and I think that I am in favor of moving in the direction of more accountability, and I'll volunteer my time to be a part of that.
Wonderful, Tom. Thank you. Recently, we started, if Chrisanne is here, Chrisanne is our administrator, she could speak to it better than I think, at the minute. We have said, yes, you are a spiritual leader, you can join the ASI, and in the next 6 months, we need you to do these things. Like set up a feedback system. Tell us how you're responding to this. There's a constant flow of people wanting to join the ASI. And one of all the people who received this letter over the last 2 months, one came back. And that spiritual leader was an attorney in his former life. So it's like there's the detail oriented and he wants to do the right thing. But generally, it's like I'll sign up in the ASI, I get the logo. I'm not going to do what they said I need to do. So does it look like that the ASI in a year's time might say, actually renew your membership? And if you don't do these things, see ya, you don't get it. That might be what we do. Just saying, just putting it out there. No decisions are made yet, but it's all up for grabs because we need teeth. Yeah. Jerry?
Well, first to speak to that, as somebody with a marketing background, it occurs to me you could have two levels of membership, and one is just simply a patron, and one is a participating member. And then they can use the logo, they can help to spread the word about ASI, but they're not putting anything over on anybody that says, oh, I'm adhering to all of the guidelines and, following all the protocols and all of that. So you can have a category that indicates that. Participating member is the thing that immediately comes to mind versus, a patron or some such thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, the thing that I'm really intensely moved to bring up here is at least 2 or 3 times in these presentations, a list has been given of sexual, financial, and emotional exploitation. We need to add to that list, and it needs to be spoken every single time, abusive volunteer labor. That absolutely destroys lives. I have lived for over 30 years with a major disability that affects me every minute of every day, and my life is a constant struggle because of the abuse of my labor, working me almost to death to try to save the world in a very big spiritual movement. And there's absolute, I'm the invisible man. Nobody knows, but we need to really get that front and center at the same level as as the rest of the list. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. Yes. Ulrika?
Oh, thank you. I have a question for Julie. I was wondering if the Zen teachers are also requested, or are there guidelines about adjusting the teachings? Because I know it's maybe not true for all spiritual traditions, but the kind of untethered ethical behavior of teachers is part of the tradition and sometimes idealized. And I'm not an expert in Zen, but I believe there are some stories of behavior in Dokusan where nowadays we would just go like, oh my God. So I'm just wondering how your organization is handling that in the teaching.
Yeah, I mean, there is some history in Zen of violence. There's stories about teachers breaking their student's leg to bring about great enlightenment. Not recommended. And also a thing called crazy wisdom. That there, because you are dealing with these areas that are out of the ordinary, this out of the ordinary behavior, and a lot of abuse has been excused under these. I mean, looking at sort of the sets of historical teachings, like anything that's developed over hundreds and hundreds of years, you can probably find whatever you're looking for, right? So, in the group, the community that I'm in now, we're trying to really sort through what is it from the heritage and the tradition that we need to honor and learn from, right? And what parts do we need to say, no? I mean, Zen is historically totally patriarchal, right? It was the line of male ancestors that you trace your lineage transmission through, right? More recently, people have used added women ancestors charts. I'm going to turn off my video for a second. I put together something that speaks to me, which is an ancestor nest, listing not only the teachers, but also the communities and the places that I feel have nurtured my practice and the birth of my little Buddha baby. So that's what that representation is. So, I couldn't really, I have the patriarchal chart, and it does not resonate with my understanding of, how to honor the tradition. So trying to, innovate a lot of different ways, I think, very, and a number of groups are trying different ways of sorting out what we got from our history and what we really feel is authentic now. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Julie, we've 5 minutes. Would you like to pull it together or conclude?
I don't know. I feel like I talked a lot.
Mm,
So,
mm.
but I have to say it's really uh great to hear so many of you, or see so many of you nodding along and speaking out and asking good questions and coming up with good ideas. Um, as Jacques has said and recognized, that ASA currently is accountability light, and that has been bothersome to me. And it would be really wonderful if, as a community, we could make ASI, or at least part of ASI or something, one of these professional organizations with standards that make a difference, that will help prevent some of this. Yeah, it looks like Rick has raised his hand.
Yeah, this is Rick Archer. I'm logged in as ASI right now, but I just have a brief comment, which kind of an overarching observation, which is that when you survey the landscape of all these spiritual teachers who have misbehaved, sometimes so egregiously, you wonder, what is enlightenment supposed to be? I mean, if this is the way such people behave, if I'm from a perspective of a student, let's say, and I see all these teachers behaving this way, do I want that? Do I want to be like them? So, I really wonder about the correlation between supposed attainments in consciousness and a person's behavior. And I'm leaving that as an open question, but something to contemplate, because I, you know, I'm of the opinion that the spiritual teachers should not only walk their talk, but walk their state of consciousness. And if they have actually attained something worthwhile, there should be a certain degree of saintliness, not necessarily perfection, but at least a modicum of ethical behavior, if not an exemplar of ethical behavior in their conduct. Anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there.
I would just add one part to that, or should at least be aware that they are not an exemplar of ethical consciousness. Just to be aware that you are subject to delusion and are probably making mistakes is a big jump over what I've seen among so many spiritual teachers who are just overconfident, just confident that they know the right thing.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. I am going to go out of my comfort zone again and repost our donate button, it being Thanksgiving week and Giving Tuesday and all that next week. So, Devlin, would you like to share? We've just got a minute, if it can be really short.
Thanks. I'll just jump in really quick. Thanks so much for this really rich conversation. Such an important conversation that's just not happening enough. Julie, you talked about creating feedback systems, in our teachings and in the way that we roll with our students, so to speak. And, I think that could be a really wonderful, next conversation is really diving into, how do we create these systems within our practice, within our spiritual communities, even like a skill share around that. I think there's a lot of different ways to approach it, and I'd love to hear more about that. Thanks again.
I love when things like this come together because our next webinar it's either January or February, and it's on feedback. It's literally on that, and it's one of our own community who will be we're totally feeling where this wants to go, which is so exciting. Yeah, let's up our game. Thank you, Julie, for your path, for walking your path. It's not been easy, and you keep going, and you are alchemizing the experiences you've been through. Again, Julie's book, it's great. Also, somebody else mentioned Kylea Taylor's book, which is kind of a go-to for me too, The Ethics of Self-Caring. These are two strong books to add to your own guidelines until the ASI can find its voice with having more teeth. I hope to see you at the next webinar where we explore what Devlin segued into beautifully. Let's do this together because it has to be done in a wee space. It has to be done in a wee space, and we can support each other because the importance of peer support, as was said here, around places where teachers can talk to teachers, and the power game is outside of the field. So let's continue to grow this sacred field among ourselves. But we can't do it without each one of you. So thank you for showing up. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for wanting to do better.
And Jack, if people want more Julie, I've done a 2-hour interview with Julie that they can find on Batgap.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rick. Happy Thanksgiving and happy holidays, and whatever it is for you, enjoy. Thank you all.